The United Arab Emirates quits OPEC, the oil-producing bloc losing one of its most important members. It comes during the worst global energy crisis of modern times, caused by the Iran war, which has hit the UAE hard. So, why now? And what's the impact? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. There's plenty of uncertainty in the world's energy markets since the U.S. and Israel launched their attacks on Iran at the end of February. Now, there's even more. With the surprise move by the United Arab Emirates to quit OPEC, the world's largest oil-producing group. Attacks by Iran have hit the UAE and its energy sector hard, with severe impact on the general economy and vital tourism sector. There's also been tension for some time with OPEC's quotas, with the UAE eager to sell more than it's allowed. Then there are the political difficulties with OPEC's largest member, Saudi Arabia, on Yemen and Sudan, as well as the regional response to Iran's attacks on the UAE. So, as the Gulf energy supply crisis continues with the standoff between the U.S. and Iran blocking the Strait of Hormuz, why has the UAE decided to quit OPEC at this time? And what impact will this have globally? We'll get to our guest shortly, but first, this report from Narges Mobalei.
A sudden announcement and an abrupt exit. The UAE says after 6 decades it will leave OPEC on May the 1st. The timing, as the region and the world are at a critical crossroads because of war and energy instability. The Emirati government described the decision as a sovereign and strategic choice.
The UAE's decision to exit from OPEC reflects a policy-driven evolution aligned with long-term market fundamentals. We thank OPEC and its member countries for decades of constructive cooperation. We remain committed to energy security, providing reliable, responsible, and lower carbon supply while supporting stable global markets.
OPEC produces nearly 40% of the world's oil supply and holds around 80% of the world's proven crude oil reserves. The departure of the UAE means the loss of its third largest producer, which is responsible for around an eighth of what the organisation supplies to the world. OPEC was founded in 1960 by Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia and Venezuela to coordinate production, control supply and set prices. The UAE joined in 1967, and until now, OPEC has had 12 members. Its broader coalition, OPEC Plus, has 10 members, including Russia. The UAE is leaving both. It says it wants out of the production limitations set by OPEC that are heavily influenced by Saudi Arabia. Instead, it plans to scale up its output, something that could challenge Riyadh and OPEC. But that's not something it can do now. The war on Iran and the US blockade of Iranian ports along the Strait of Hormuz means the UAE is exporting about half of its normal volume of 3.4 million barrels a day. While the UAE says the decision is based on domestic policy, not politics, the timing of the announcement is crucial. The UAE has faced the brunt of Iran's retaliatory attacks. It's been targeted with more than 2,000 missiles and drones. Abu Dhabi has openly criticised what it considers the weak response of Arab and Muslim states. It has doubled down on its alliance with the United States. The exit from OPEC will be a win for President Donald Trump, who has accused the organisation of ripping off the rest of the world by inflating oil prices.
This could be some kind of behind-the-scenes deal. The US promised financial assistance to the UAE, which has indeed suffered from the current crisis, and in return, the US is asking for help that essentially undermines OPEC from within. That's in order to lower prices on the global market.
But it's not clear yet what impact this will have on the future of OPEC and global oil prices. Narges Mobalei, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests now. In London, Chris Weafer, Chief Executive Officer at Macro Advisory Strategic Consultancy. In the Swiss city of Bern, Cornelia Meyer, CEO of Meyer Resources and an oil and gas specialist. And in Edinburgh, Scotland, Torbjorn Soltvedt, Associate Director at the global risk intelligence company, Verisk Maplecroft. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Chris, let me start with you. How significant is this move by the UAE to exit OPEC? And what, from your perspective, will the ramifications be?
Yeah, I think it's very significant. As you said in the introduction, UAE is the third largest producer within the group. It has long been complaining about the fact that it has made investments in raising capacity, and that's not been reflected in the quotas that have been agreed within OPEC. So this is something it's been complaining about for a decade or more, rather than recently. So, to the extent, therefore, that the UAE is now, leaving OPEC, it really isn't a great surprise. Perhaps the timing always is, but the fact that it has just lost patience with OPEC and being constrained by the quotas is not a surprise. But it is a big deal because, as I say, it is the third largest producer. It has spare capacity of around 1 million barrels. So if it does not cooperate with OPEC or OPEC Plus in the future, then that's going to be significant in terms of oil pricing.
Cornelia, Chris, they're saying it's not a big surprise, but it is a big deal. Let me ask you, from where you're sitting, were you surprised by the UAE's decision, or do you think that this was ultimately predictable? And at a time when the Iran war has disrupted global energy supplies so much, how much impact will the timing of this announcement have?
Thank you very much for having me, Mohammed. I was and I wasn't surprised. I was surprised about the timing, but there have been rumors for a long time. And as Chris said, the UAE was very unhappy and felt it had invested billions in upping its production capacity, and it could not monetize that because of the quotas. So yes. On the other hand, I think this is in many ways a good time to do it because most of the UAE's and most people's and most countries' production is trapped on the other side of Hormuz, and except for 1.5 million barrels a day from the pipeline from Abu Dhabi to Fujairah. So in this precise moment, it doesn't have such an impact. It drove prices up, but it doesn't have such an impact. I think, though, once we go on the other side of the conflict, what it will do is, if anything, it will add volatility, which is neither to the markets, which is neither good for consumers nor for producers.
Torbjorn, you had Cornelia there talking about potential volatility going forward. I want to ask you, why do you think the UAE chose to make this move now? And overall, how much damage do you think this could cause to OPEC?
Yeah, I think first of all, in terms of the damage that it could cause to OPEC, this is a pivotal moment for OPEC. This is the highest profile departure that we've seen from the group to date. We're talking about 13% of total OPEC capacity. The UAE is a very important actor on the global stage. As Cornelia said, volatility is a key word. If we look beyond the current conflict, if we were to see some kind of resolution, then absolutely the UAE would be in a good position if there's a race to increase capacity. Longer term, there's obviously an ambition to raise production to about 5 million barrels per day. Higher supply could mean lower prices. But again, when it comes to volatility, you could end up in a scenario where we see, more price wars, like we've seen in the past with Russia and Saudi Arabia, for example. If the UAE is sitting outside of the wider OPEC and OPEC Plus framework, then there's a greater chance that we see disagreements over management over the market. We see price wars, which we've seen in recent decades, is something that can drive greater price volatility. And OPEC, for all of its faults, has been reasonably successful over the last few years in managing market and minimizing volatility. Obviously, leaving the current disruption as a result of the war to one side.
Cornelia, I see you reacting to what Torbjorn was saying there, so I want to give you a chance to jump in.
Well, no, Torbjorn is absolutely right, and I think the volatility is a big deal. But unlike the Russia KSA price war, which was 10 million barrels versus 10 million barrels, the UAE is still a lot smaller compared to the big elephants in the room, being Russia, being KSA. It's at this point, they produce 3.4 million barrels a day in February. They have a capacity of between 4 and 5 million barrels. By next year, they'll have 5 million barrels. So yes, it's material, but it is not as material as when the two big guys have a war. And when I look at OPEC, and at OPEC plus, for many of the countries, it actually is not a bad thing to be in that alliance, because you have the US very dominant as the biggest producer. You have a lot of new production having come on from Brazil, Guyana, Argentina, and so on. So for most of the current members of OPEC and OPEC Plus, it must give them some comfort to be in an association that can give us some sort of a counterweight.
Chris, Cornelia there was talking specifically at one point in her answer about the U.S. increasing its production. I want to ask you a little bit about that because the U.S. increased its production of crude oil in recent years. How much has that caused OPEC's market power to wane?
Oh, significantly. I think if you look at, say, the relationship between OPEC and the US, for example, you can mark, say, 2016 as a major turning point between relations between the US generally and OPEC and the Gulf countries, and that's when the US started to ramp up shale oil production significantly. Before that, the narrative within OPEC was that it was a reliable, stable a supplier of oil for the world, and that the US would defend the region militarily. But that really started to change with the shale revolution. And we know that there has been an enormous amount of frustration for quite some time within OPEC, but particularly in Saudi and in the Gulf, about the fact that they see the US kind of broke the deal by ramping up shale and taking market share. And really the relationship has not been the same since. One point worth noting, though, maybe slightly on the aside, late last year, there was a report from the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank, which said that at the time, there was a real danger of a financial crisis and collapse in the US independent shale producer sector because the costs were rising and they weren't getting enough. So they were talking about $55, $60 as being bare minimum for that sector. So now those independent producers, of course, are making a lot of money. That financial risk is eased, and they can invest more. So the US factor is significant. We know the US relationship with the UAE is better than the relationship with Saudi. So, of course, that's given rise to speculation that the timing of this announcement may have been coordinated between Abu Dhabi and Washington, because, again, we know that Congress and Washington generally has been complaining for decades about what it referred to as an illegal cartel, has been threatening it regularly. And now this is a major move by a US ally to exit and therefore call into question the future of the group as a whole. That will suit the US for sure.
Chris, you mentioned the tensions between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. That's what I wanted to ask you about next, because we know that the UAE and Saudi Arabia have in recent years, they've increasingly competed over economic issues, over regional politics, particularly in the Red Sea, places like Yemen. How much is that playing into all of this right now?
Oh, I think that's a very significant factor. We have seen, a real change in the relationship between the UAE and Saudi, particularly since the emergence of Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince in Saudi, and also the new ruler in Abu Dhabi, Mohammed bin Zayed. Two relatively young leaders, very ambitious, and they want to develop their countries to become regional powers. And the UAE absolutely does not want to play second fiddle to Saudi Arabia. So they have been skirmishing over lots of issues in the region. For example, in Yemen, in January, Saudi Arabia issued a direct order to the UAE to take its military out of Yemen, which it did within 24 hours. Under a threat of attack, and they are competing in Sudan and a couple of other areas. So I think this break within OPEC signals the fact that we are now going to see probably more of a, I would say low level, but nevertheless more of a confrontational relationship between the UAE and Saudi, rather than either cooperative or maybe in the case of UAE, kind of playing a subservience to Riyadh. That's over. So we are seeing now the emergence of a different political dynamic in the region because of this event.
Torbjorn, I have a question for you. I'm going to come to you in just a minute, but Cornelia, it looks like you wanted to interject a point there while Chris was speaking, so I'm going to go ahead and give the floor to you.
Well, Chris is right. I mean, we see that rivalry, and we also see that the UAE is very confident, sees itself as, they've diversified so well away from oil and gas that they see themselves as the New York of the region. But don't underestimate KSA, because KSA is the big behemoth. It's the country with 40 plus million people with a lot of land. So in the end, yes, there is dissonance. But whatever you do, I would say do not underestimate KSA.
Torbjorn, where do you stand on this question? I mean, how much do you think that tensions between Saudi Arabia and the UAE have played into the decision made by the UAE to exit OPEC at this time?
Yeah, I completely agree that it is one of the factors, and I think the UAE has obviously framed this in kind of strategic and economic terms. But it's very difficult to separate that from the broader political context. And tensions between Saudi Arabia and the UAE have, generally speaking, been getting worse over some time, for several years. And I think we especially saw a significant worsening in December 2025 over the situation in Yemen and the civil war there. That obviously spilled over into 2026. Then, there was perhaps some hope that, one of the, good outcomes of the current war was that, tensions between Saudi Arabia and the UAE could be mended, and that they could work together to address the threat posed by Iran. We obviously had a GCC meeting yesterday, just before the announcement from the UAE, where, the Gulf response to Iran's attack came up. And so what we've seen in practice is that the conflict actually, if anything, is just added to the number of friction points between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. They have been, affected very differently by this war. Both countries have seen critical energy infrastructure targeted. But the UAE, we're talking about, close to 3,000 drones and missiles that have been launched by Iran, and a much lower amount if you look at Saudi Arabia. In terms of the economic implications, Saudi Arabia has been able to reroute a lot of its oil exports. So in terms of revenue, the impact hasn't been quite as bad. Whereas for the UAE, they're seeing a fall in oil revenue. So all of these friction points, whether security policy, energy policy, have come together now. And it comes back to the point about timing. And I think a really interesting point that I haven't touched on is, this kind of strange situation where you have an organization, OPEC, where one member state, Iran, is launching drones and missiles against other OPEC member states. And, that is probably something that's also factored into the timing of the UAE's decision to leave OPEC.
Torbjorn, I want to ask you also about the issue of if the UAE is now free of its constraints, if it can produce freely, does that open the door for other producers to reconsider their commitments to OPEC quotas?
I think in the longer term, that is going to be a challenge for OPEC. One of the biggest concerns right now is that, you have even fewer countries with spare capacity. The UAE was one of the countries that could, very quickly react if there was a need to ramp up oil production. Now you're talking about, very limited supply. If we think about the situation in a kind of a post-conflict situation, you have Saudi Arabia, Kuwait might have some limited spare capacity, but beyond that, there's very little. So I think for OPEC, that is going to be a concern, that it doesn't have the same amount of leverage in terms of spare capacity. And of course, there's going to be concern within OPEC that other member states might reconsider their membership. Countries like Venezuela potentially is a natural country to think of next in terms of whether OPEC can prevent further countries from leaving the group.
Cornelia, in light of all that's happening, do you think that we might start seeing nations with spare capacity opting to essentially cash out their reserves rather than use them to adjust the market?
I doubt it. I think in many ways, with OPEC Plus, you have a cohort. And yes, you're right on Venezuela, maybe thinking because they're now under so-called new management. But then Venezuela is a whale when it comes to reserves. It's a midget when it comes to production, and it's not that production can't be ramped up that easily. So it would not be, and it would not have an impact like a leaving of the UAE. So yes, but I think OPEC will do its best to keep cohorts together. And in many ways, sort of the market management that it has done has, yes, maybe not helped if you had excess spare capacity, but who has excess spare capacity? So prudent management becomes very important.
Chris, the UAE doubled down with relations with the U.S. when it decided to join the 2020 Abraham Accords. During the war with Iran, the UAE has faced the brunt of Iran's retaliatory attacks. Torbjorn was mentioning that as well. It's been targeted with more than 2,000 missiles and drones.
Sure.
Abu Dhabi has openly criticized what it considers to be a weak response of Arab and Muslim states in the wake of all that. I'm curious to get your take on whether you think that the UAE's relationship with Israel has been one of the reasons that it's faced so many attacks from Iran. And how much do you think that the severity of those attacks that the UAE faced from Iran has played into the decision potentially to have left OPEC?
I wouldn't overplay that. I think that the UAE has been a target, as has Qatar, of course, and Bahrain. A, because they're physically much closer, therefore they're better targets, as it were. And B, all three countries host significant U.S. military presence. In the case of the UAE, its intelligence and its air force, the same with the other countries. So that made them targets really, rather than anything to do with Israel. But can I just add one factor here, and again to do with the timing, is that I certainly wouldn't ever want to speculate on this old chestnut of peak oil, but there has been kind of more and more discussion about the fact that there's been more investment into renewable energy, into alternative energies, and question marks over how long an organization like OPEC, not that it would supply oil, but when it can control, how long can it control pricing. There is certainly an argument to be made that as a result of this latest war and the blockade in the Straits and the price hike, that will even add more impetus and it will accelerate more investment in big developed economies into renewable energy. So you could argue, therefore, that the remaining window when OPEC producers can control the price, the point where renewable energy becomes a much bigger factor and oil a much smaller factor, that's now going to come closer even as a result of this. Therefore, you could argue that the UAE just sees the fact that it needs to grab cash flow for the next 5 years as much as it can, rather than cooperating with other countries that need cash flow, and in 5 or 6 years' time, that opportunity is lost. So it's also considering that the UAE has lost LNG production and will need to substitute that with oil. So I'm just throwing it out as a speculative factor, but it's certainly not inconsequential in my opinion.
Cornelia, I see you. It looks as though you are disagreeing to what Chris is saying. So please go ahead and jump in.
Yes, I do disagree, because when I look over the last, 10 years or so, year on year, oil demand, we are talking about peak oil demand. Demand has gone up by about 1 million barrels a day. Yes, it's not gone up that much in the OECD countries, but when I look at the countries where the population is growing and where we will have 2 billion people more by 2050, which is Africa and South Asia, it's really the demand is growing, and I foresee that growing as well. Look, in 1974, when we had the first oil shock, 80% of primary energy demand was fossil fuels. I did a piece in last year, where I saw that at the end of 2024, we were just still around 80%. So yes, we substitute between coal, oil, gas, and so on. But I foresee, given that we will have 2 billion people more inhabiting planet Earth until 2050, I still see there plenty of opportunity for demand and demand growth.
Torbjorn, we've been talking mostly about OPEC, but we've also mentioned OPEC Plus in this discussion. I want to ask you a little bit about that because in recent years, OPEC aligned with 11 oil-producing countries outside the OPEC member states. This group includes Russia. It's known as OPEC Plus. Help us understand the significance of the UAE not just leaving OPEC, but also leaving OPEC Plus and what that means for the wider world and for oil markets.
Sure, it's an important distinction because we've seen, OPEC Plus, has, since at least 2020, started to play more of a significant role in managing the oil market. OPEC obviously acknowledges that there are, some big producers that sit outside OPEC that it needs to work with if it wants to kind of move the needle on prices. So I think the fact that the UAE is choosing not just to leave OPEC, but also OPEC Plus, is interesting in itself. You have other Gulf states like Bahrain and Oman, they're not in OPEC, but they cooperate, through OPEC Plus. So it does kind of raise further questions about, the extent to which the UAE will be taking a more independent route. We know that it has, a relatively low fiscal break-even price, so it needs a lower price to balance its. Saudi Arabia does. So that is another important distinction that we haven't talked about so far. So it does very much kind of raise this question of whether or not kind of Saudi Arabia, whether the UAE is kind of determined to kind of chart its own course in the global oil market. So it does add a bit of uncertainty. In practice, and we will probably see coordination between the UAE and both OPEC and OPEC Plus. But the fact that it sits outside OPEC Plus, is an interesting signal.
Chris, we just have about a minute left. Let me just ask you, seeing where we're at right now, do you anticipate there could be further fracturing of OPEC going forward?
Yeah, I think so. But the smaller producers, I think, really don't matter that much. But as Cornelia has already mentioned, I think Venezuela will now come under a lot of U.S. pressure to leave. I would think that's almost inevitable, in my opinion. Within OPEC Plus, and the Kazakhs have been kind of more or less ignoring their quota for a very long time. Their quota is about 1.4 million barrels. They're producing close to 2 million. They could now just take the opportunity and leave OPEC Plus. So I do expect more fracturing. I don't expect yet the breakup of OPEC. I think the Saudis will make every effort to keep that together. But I would certainly expect OPEC to be a much less potent and much less price influential organization over the next decade than it has been for the last 6 decades.
All right, we're going to have to leave the discussion there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Chris Weafer, Cornelia Meyer, and Torbjorn Soltvedt. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For now, that's it for me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here. Al Jazeera's coverage continues in just a moment. Stay tuned.